It was one of those nights when everything seemed normal. I had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to getting home. The road I usually took was always quiet, surrounded by tall trees and deep shadows. But that night, something felt different. As I drove, the music playing on the radio was soft and my mind started to wander. The sky was clear, and the full moon illuminated the road. However, as I went further, I noticed there were no other cars in sight. The silence was almost deafening, and I wondered if it was just my imagination or if there really was something strange about that night. After a few minutes of driving alone, I saw a figure by the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, waving his hand. He was wearing a dark jacket and looked a bit worn out. For a moment, I thought about ignoring him and driving on, but my instinct to help kicked in. I decided to stop. "Do you need a ride?" I asked as he approached. "Yes, please," he replied, with a smile that seemed more relieved than happy. "I've been waiting for hours. My car broke down." He got into the car, and I watched him out of the corner of my eye as I accelerated again. There was something about him that made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The man seemed grateful, but at the same time, he had a distant expression. He looked out the window as if lost in his own thoughts. "Do you live around here?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "Not really," he replied, turning to me. "I'm from another town. I'm just passing through, visiting some friends." Hearing that, my nervousness increased. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. But, like we often do, I decided to let it go and focus on the road. The road remained deserted, and the fog began to form around us. Strangely, it seemed like the trees were closing in around us, creating a claustrophobic feeling. The man next to me started looking around, as if he was remembering something, and I couldn't help but ask, "Have you been through here before?" He hesitated before answering. "Yes, a long time ago. This road is interesting." The way he said it made my stomach turn. It was like he knew something I didn't. The atmosphere in the car grew heavy, and a growing tension started to spread between us. The music on the radio got quieter, and silence began to settle in again. That's when I noticed something even stranger. With every turn we took, it seemed like the fog thickened, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The man next to me started to get restless. He looked over at me, and his expression kept changing. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't figure out. "Hey, are you feeling okay?" I asked, trying to break the ice again. "Yes, I just don't really like this road," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "There's a strange story about it." "Strange story? What are you talking about?" I questioned, curiosity getting the better of me. "Some people say this road is cursed," he said, a nervous smile appearing on his face. "I've heard stories of people disappearing here. They hitch rides, but they never reach their destination." At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I thought he was joking, but the seriousness in his eyes made me question it. "Are you serious?" "Yes. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. Some people believe this road leads to nowhere." I tried to laugh off the situation, but the sound came out more nervous than I expected. "That's just an urban legend, right?" "Maybe, but you never know," he said, staring intently at the road ahead. "Once I hitched a ride with a guy who seemed normal, but he wouldn't let me go. I thought it was the end." At that moment, my heart started to race. I didn't know if I was more scared by the story or by the man sitting next to me. The car continued to be swallowed by the fog, and the feeling that something was wrong grew with each passing second. I decided to speed up a bit, hoping to get out of that strange situation. But as we moved forward, the man began murmuring to himself, almost inaudibly, and I couldn't understand what he was saying. "You can't let them get you. You can't." "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, glancing quickly at him. He turned his head toward me suddenly, his eyes wide. "Sorry. Sometimes I just get lost in thought." The atmosphere was becoming unbearable. As I drove, I started considering my options. I could stop the car and ask him to leave, but what if he didn't want to? What if he did something? Finally, after a few tense minutes, I saw a small light ahead. It was a gas station, a familiar place where I could stop and feel safe. I sped up and soon we arrived. As I parked, I looked at the man beside me. "This is my stop," he said, a strange smile on his lips. "Are you getting out?" I asked, hoping he'd say yes. "Yes, of course." But he hesitated, looking at the door as if he didn't want to leave. "Just let me tell you one thing first." "Sure," I replied nervously. He leaned in closer and I could smell the sweat mixed with something strange, almost like a rotten odor. "You need to know that sometimes, when you drive through here, things aren't what they seem. Sometimes you might pick up a ride, but you might also become one of them." I felt my heart race as he spoke. What did he mean by one of them? Before I could ask, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, disappearing into the fog of the gas station. I sat there, unsure of what to do. I decided I needed to leave, but as soon as I turned the car on, I noticed the fog had cleared, and there was no sign that the man had entered the station or even left. My instincts screamed for me to leave, and that's exactly what I did. I sped off, driving fast away from that cursed road. No matter what had happened, I just wanted to get home and forget about that night. When I finally got home, the feeling of relief was overwhelming, but there was something inside me that made me think about the man. Who was he? And why did his words keep echoing in my mind? I knew I'd never set foot on that road again. And to this day, whenever I see an empty road at night, I can't help but think about the possibility that something or someone might be waiting for me in the dark. It was a summer night, and I was driving home after visiting a friend who lived on the other side of town. The road was deserted, and the sound of the tires on the asphalt was the only thing breaking the silence of the night. The trees stood tall around me, their dark silhouettes contrasting with the glow of the full moon. I always thought driving at night was relaxing, but that night, something didn't feel right. As I passed through a more isolated stretch of road, a fog began to form, covering the road ahead of me. It wasn't a normal fog. It was dense and almost opaque. I slowed down, keeping my eyes on the road, and tried not to think about how strange it was. After all, who's ever heard of fog at that time of night in the middle of summer? As I focused on the road, a bright light appeared ahead. I blinked my eyes and quickly realized it was a car, coming towards me on the wrong side. The vehicle was approaching fast, and I barely managed to swerve to avoid an accident. But as soon as the car passed by me, something left me frozen. The driver didn't look over, and the car seemed to be moving erratically, like the person behind the wheel wasn't in control. I couldn't see any details of the car, just a shadow crossing the road and disappearing into the fog. I was left with a strange feeling, like something was seriously wrong. I decided it was best to call my friend and tell him what was happening. Sometimes talking helps calm the mind. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I realized the road was completely empty, and that only increased my discomfort. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the fog had become even thicker. My gut was screaming that it was time to get out of there, so I pressed the gas, hoping the road would open up and I could get away from that place. As I sped up, I tried to ignore the feeling that something was following me. The silence became oppressive, and the only sound I could hear was my car's engine and the faint crackling of the fog around me. But then I noticed something that put me on high alert. A small, bright point of light appeared on the road ahead. It wasn't a regular light. It looked like a swinging lantern, like someone was walking down the road. As I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man wearing a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. He was standing in the middle of the road, swinging the lantern back and forth. At first, I thought about stopping and asking if he needed help, but something about his stance made me hesitate. It was like he was waiting for me. I slowed down, but as soon as I passed him, I felt a wave of relief as I moved away. However, the feeling didn't last long. As soon as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw that the man had turned around, his eyes glowing in the lantern's light, watching me as I drove away. An urgency to leave that road filled me. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. Who was he? What was he doing out there in the middle of the night? The fog seemed to get thicker with every second, and I didn't know how long had passed since I left the figure behind. All I wanted was to get home and forget about that strange night. Then something else caught my attention. Another car appeared on the road coming from the opposite direction, but this one was different. It was moving slowly, almost as if it was floating. The driver had the window down and I could hear loud music coming from the car. It was a cheerful melody, but in contrast to the darkness around me, it sounded sinister. As the car passed, I glanced over and saw the driver. It was a woman, but her face was pale and expressionless, like she was in a trance. The music kept playing as she passed, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. After she disappeared into the fog, the silence settled in again. I knew something was terribly wrong. I looked at the clock in my car and realized that more than an hour had passed since I got on that road. The sense of disorientation grew, and the fog was so dense now that I could barely see more than 10 feet in front of me. That's when I noticed something moving in the fog on my left. It looked like a figure approaching. I wasn't sure if it was the man with the lantern or someone else, but the certainty that I wasn't alone on that deserted road made my body freeze. The figure got closer and my instinct was to speed up, but to my surprise, it simply materialized in the headlights. It was a boy, maybe about 10 years old, wearing a torn shirt and dirty jeans. He was standing in the middle of the road, staring at me. His eyes were empty, and a deep sadness was etched on his face. I thought about stopping, but the sense of danger was overwhelming. The boy extended his hand like he was asking for help, but my body wouldn't respond. I quickly glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that the man with the lantern had reappeared, now getting closer to the car. Desperate, I made a sharp turn and sped in the opposite direction, ignoring what might happen. The car shook, but I kept going, feeling my heart racing. The road seemed endless and the fog didn't let up. At this point, my mind was in a whirlwind. What had I seen? Who were those people? Was I dreaming? But the terror I felt was all too real. After a few minutes of pure adrenaline, I finally saw the city lights approaching. The fog began to clear, and I pressed the gas even harder, not looking back. As soon as I reached the city, a wave of relief washed over me, but the weirdness of that night still lingered with me. When I finally parked at home, the weight of what happened still hung in the air. I wondered if those encounters had been real, or if they were just figments of my imagination. But one thing was certain: I would never drive down that deserted road alone again.